And welcome to this edition of the Native News Update on this Thursday, January 27th. I'm your host for today's program, Paul DeMain. And today we talk with Shoshone Bannock Correspondent Mark Trahant, who has looked at the Republican budget cutting plans and peeked in on today's State of the Tribal Nations address at IndianCountryTV.com, where the president of the National Congress of American Indians focused his attention on both emerging technologies and the unique constitutional treaty relationship the United States has with tribes, and the obligations that go along with that. And Trahant's thinking about where the potential budget cuts will fall in Indian country here in the near future. Mark Trahant, the president of the National Congress of American Indians this morning, Jefferson Keel, gave a report to the United States and wherever else. Actually, we were watching on the live stream channel throughout the world, my understanding. It was the State of the Indians Nations address, and Senator Lisa Murkowski followed with a response. She's a Republican from Alaska, gave the congressional response. What can you tell about what you saw in those presentations today?
Well, first, I think it's really important that it's a really smart thing for the National Congress of American Indians to do this, that it lays out the case for the programmatic needs for Indian country in a very methodical, thoughtful way. And I think it was also very smart to bring in someone from the Congress to add, in this case, her perspective. If I would suggest anything, it would be to bring in a real critic to open those bridges. I think if you could have got someone like Paul Ryan there or Doc Hastings, it would have at least allowed some back and forth with there are different views about how to deal with this and to get a sense of how serious the climate is right now.
Indeed. It seems to me, though, that Paul Ryan is going to be overseeing appropriations.
Right. He's been giving basically full authority to set the table for the Appropriations Committee chairman. So he will pass them a number, and that'll be it, whatever number he passes out. So he's going to be very critical of the process. The House Study Republican Committee, which is probably the most conservative part of the House, has proposed a plan that would roll back things to 2008 levels and make some pretty serious cuts across the board.
Let's talk. Well, let me one question first. Does Murkowski have any pull to balance this thing off if so-called Indian country gets in trouble in the budget process?
Well, I mean, they're going to have to get the House and the Senate to agree, and that's at some point a saving grace. That at some point they'll have to find some sort of compromise. That said, some of these folks are so zealous that they wouldn't mind shutting down the government, and if there is no resolution, that's what they could do. So they have, in a sense, an extra card to play.
Yesterday, we picked up an Associated Press article that basically says that looking at some of the final numbers has even shocked some of the Republican proponents of this budget cutting proposal. That literally, when it gets down to the nuts and bolts of the thing, you're going to see Republicans who are not going to agree with some of the sizes of these budget cuts. And the article that came out talks about eliminating $1 of every $6 worth of spending, and everything is on the hook. The 2008 expenditure level, without even cut, just going back to the 2008 expenditure level, would remove, I'm looking for the number on the Indian Health Service. You got that number?
It would be about a 30% reduction. Is kind of the number I've been looking at.
Okay, but there was a hard number on it, something
hard.
$24 million or more than
More
that. Let's see if I can find it while we're talking about it. But what do you see on the budget? What do you see? Where are the cuts across the board? How's that going to impact people?
Well, I think the test is going to be: are they really going to cut everything, or are they just going to attack programs like the Indian Health Service? A good gauge of that would be, what are they going to do with subsidies? There is a huge system of farm subsidies, water subsidies, crop supports, and are they going to go after that? Now, Rand Paul, who represents, I guess, the libertarian wing of this whole thing, proposed his own budget yesterday, and that calls for the elimination of the Bureau of Reclamation and selling it off.
And that's a Tea Party proposal.
That's a Tea Party proposal. Now, that has unbelievable implications. You look at cities like Denver, Salt Lake City, Phoenix, that rely on water, and if they suddenly had to pay market rates for water, people would be looking at 400 or 500% increases in their water bill. Not only that, you look across big agricultural places like California, they only pay $10 an acre foot for water often. And municipal water authorities now pay on average $90. So you can see how big that gap is.
Are people just whipping out ideas without really looking at the potential impact back in some of these districts? I mean, are these any of these proposals well thought out that are coming out of the Tea Party?
Hell no.
I was,
No.
in noting that I was only $975 million off when I gave you that $24 million figure. It says, and a 1,024% cut to the historically underfunded Indian Health Service. So I apologize for being $975 million off.
Which is basically my 30% number. And basically that's even underestimating it because we're halfway into the budget year. To make up that cut is even going to be more pronounced to try to do it in this fiscal year. So the other one that I think is just, and let me just say this. You got to hand it to the president. His budget proposal is the one that is well thought out. It's calling it a freeze, but it's not really a freeze the way most people think of it. He would set an overall cap for spending that would freeze the money that they're doing. But within that, he would have some programs get more, some programs get less. He'd be very methodical about it. And it's that kind of atmosphere that's led to 13% increase for the Indian Health Service, again, because it is so underfunded.
Some of the other programs, you have former Congressman Dave Obey, weighing in here on some of this stuff. A cut from Pell Grants from the $5,550 figure by $1,000 for low-income college students. Cut back in housing subsidies, meaning hundreds of thousands of people won't see their Section 8 vouchers renewed. Low-income home energy assistance, and that's the one that Obey went after. Says people are going to have to make a decision about whether they eat or go to the doctor and all kinds of other things because they're not going to be able to heat their home without some of these subsidies in some areas of the country. And he says the Republicans in the newly elected Republicans in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and the Dakotas are sure going to note that and take heed to that because there's going to be an outroar of people who are going to say there are people who can't afford to, they can't stay in their house if they can't heat it.
Exactly. I think it's going to be sad but very interesting over the next few months as they try to navigate this. And I mean, it's one thing to say it, but to actually put it into policy is it's just a lot more complicated than they want it to be.
Anything else you see out of the National Congress address this morning? I'll make a notation. It seemed to me that both Murkowski and Keel talked a lot about internet technology and internet businesses and broadband and those kinds of things. What do you hear out of that?
Well, before I get to broadband, President Keel used that I think is going to be really important over the next few years is the phrase constitutional treaties.
You wanted to tell me a little bit about something that President Keel addressed at the meeting this morning. Tell me again what that was that you heard from him about the treaty issue.
Well, Jefferson Keel used a phrase that I think is really important, and that's the idea of constitution, linking the Constitution to treaties. I think it's the best selling point we have with this Congress since they read the Constitution out loud on the floor, and it shows that this is a long-term issue with the founders, not just current governments, and I think it's probably the best case going forward.
You think? You think they ought to read the treaties out loud on the floor to make themselves familiar with those constitutional documents as well?
Well, there you go. I think that would be, and then you can get into the whole idea of how you interpret it. But I think it's important to remind people about that in this climate.
As long as the grass grows and the rivers flow, and some of the rivers don't flow, and some of the grass doesn't grow, but there is provisions for healthcare and education, and they're deeply steeped in historical constitutional documents.
Right, exactly. Now, in terms of broadband, it was brought up. NCAI's budget calls for an investment in broadband. It would absolutely be fabulous if we could get that money out of this Congress. I wouldn't hold my breath. The one thought I had, though, is what about taking that number as what's needed and then having and seeing if tribes would explore other alternatives, whether it be private ventures, other governments, like maybe even China, but just look for some other alternative to get broadband going because it is such an important economic venture.
Right. You might find some private enterprises that are willing to make some kind of a deep investment because it seems like we've got the backbone running across the country. We're just not getting these little ancillary trunk accesses. We got fiber optic very close by to our office here, but nobody out here other than the community college uses fiber optic.
Interesting. Yeah, exactly.
It's close by. We just got to get hooked up. So the question is where does the money come from? It's an expensive proposition, but seems to me to be getting less expensive all the time and absolutely more necessary.
Right. Just get your scissors out.
I might want to go do that, see if I can figure out how to insert a little something in there and peek at it. But yeah. Anything else you want to add to what you heard this morning or seeing in the budget process?
No, what I'm going to write is what I would hope the tribes start thinking about is preparing basically plans to be as independent as possible from the federal government, that to look for alternatives to build up, to protect the workforce, protect people, the mission of serving people, kind of a contingency plan without federal money. Because if we get some this time, use it to plan ahead because it's going to be bleak.
NCAI may, for the first time in some while, play a real instrument role in protecting our backs in Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, I think it has a pretty good relationship with a lot of people on the Hill, and they certainly have advocates even in the Republican Congress, so absolutely.
Good talking to you. We'll catch up with you again on the next report.
Sounds good.
Thanks, Mark.
And if you'd like to see that presentation by the National Congress of American Indians and the congressional response by Senator Lisa Murkowski, you can go to www.indiancountrytv.com on the front page there for the next 48 hours, and we'll keep that NCAI digital player with that program there. And that is the latest roundup of news from Indian Country on this edition of the Native News Update. Miigwech for showing up. Come back again soon.